Hey folks, my name is Cooper, and this is my review of Sonic the Hedgehog 3. I saw the first movie, which came out back in 2020. However, I have not seen the second movie, so I don't have a full understanding of the whole Sonic the Hedgehog universe, the movie universe. However, I don't think that I was missing out on too much by not having seen the second one. This plot was pretty self-contained, and I did grow up with Sonic and the Sega franchise, so Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Shadow are all characters I'm pretty familiar with. I would say that the main thing that was new from this movie that not having seen the second movie meant that I didn't have knowledge of was the character's affiliation with Gun. However, it was pretty easy to catch up on. It wasn't particularly subliminal or difficult to understand. The biggest addition or change in this movie was adding Shadow the Hedgehog. He was absolutely the main character in this movie. I know it's Sonic, it's the Sonic franchise, and theoretically he's the main character, but Shadow was the main appeal of this movie, and I would say the main character that you were learning about were following, and the main driver of the plot. Obviously, this movie and this whole series is meant for children. I am not a child, I'm 27 years old, so I kind of forget that I'm not the primary audience. However, I would say that I am one of the target audiences as somebody that grew up with the Sonic franchise and loves video games, loves movies, but again, I grew up playing video games. That's sort of one of the most cherished things in my heart, so I wasn't going to this, again, it was more for kids. I wasn't going in expecting some huge levels of depth or subtlety, subliminal messages, complexity. But I was pretty impressed overall with the story and the emotion that it did have in it, while still being pretty silly and pretty cartoony. Like I mentioned, Shadow is the main addition of this movie, and I would say the main appeal, the main draw of this movie. So just to talk about the characters first, I think that the plot is sort of secondary. The characters are definitely the main appeal of this movie. I have always personally been a sucker for the whole broody, sort of edgelord kind of good guy gone bad, bad guy with good intentions. Again, anti-hero is a phrase that's thrown around a lot, but that trope, that series of tropes, is one that I really appreciate. The acts bad but is good at heart, and Shadow was a very good embodiment of that. He really scratched that itch for me. The connection that he had with Maria, that they allude to and sort of show in depth in the middle of the movie, I found was very relatable. It did feel very real. Again, for being a silly cartoon child show, I did think that that relationship was pretty meaningful, and felt pretty serious. It felt pretty emotionally gripping. Again, it's I don't want to read too much into this movie, but I did feel pretty strongly about that character, Maria, and the relationship that she had with Shadow. It definitely helped me empathize with Shadow and feel like, again, he was sort of a real character with real trauma, for lack of a better word. I think trauma is the right word to use. His childlike innocence sort of always was shining through, despite what were, again, evil actions. He was absolutely in a character undergoing some or taking on some pretty evil actions. It always felt like he was following his heart, trying to follow what was right, just very conflicted, very unsure, no, not really rooted to the world, rooted to a sense of morality. And really what the issue was is that he was trying to follow what was right, and he was misled by a character that was just the wrong person. So he felt like a very empathetic character, and again, you don't necessarily agree with his actions, but it's very easy to see how he's reached these conclusions, why he's doing what he's doing, and again, I think at the end of the day, you sort of empathize with the trauma that he's gone through, which shapes his character. And obviously, he does not remain evil or undergoing or undertaking these evil actions throughout the movie. He does have a full change of heart towards the end of the movie. Not a huge spoiler, I don't think. So it does make it. It is a pretty rewarding sort of character arc for Shadow. Again, despite being a silly cartoon hedgehog, I did feel pretty connected to him as a character. Sonic, again, the so-called main character, certainly the main character of the series, but again, I think that he's the quote-unquote main character of this movie. I don't think he's really the one that we follow, but the protagonist in technical terms. Sonic's pretty annoying. I don't think that's just because I'm an adult. I think that Sonic would be pretty annoying if I was a kid as well. That's one of those characters I've just never really appreciated, the sort of overly cocky. It kind of reminds me of like Luffy, which I haven't watched all of One Piece, but I've watched enough to know this idea of just incredibly powerful, but kind of just a little bit cocky with it, a little bit dismissive of the other people around him. Again, some of this is me reading into a cartoon silly movie, but he was definitely an annoying character amongst the other characters in this movie. Tails, Knuckles were all pretty entertaining and enjoyable and easy to root for. I did think that Sonic's break bad moment, I won't get into details with it, but I thought that was pretty good when he sort of still thinks he's this good guy with the good motives and that he just needs to do everything himself because he is this overpowered, overconfident main character, right? The sort of main character syndrome that everybody suffers from sometimes. I think it was, again, we as the audience could see that he clearly had lost control and sort of lost the plot, but it's not something that he could see, and it was very understandable why. It was still easy to empathize with him and his intentions while still also seeing that his actions were not what they should be and that he had lost control. Still, overall, I kind of just think of him as annoying, though, again, some of that is just the nature of the character. I don't think it's necessarily bad writing or a bad character. I think that's just the type of character that's going to annoy me to an extent, always has since I was a little kid. And it just sort of is what it is. So, I didn't love Sonic, but a good part of the story overall, and I appreciated what he brought. Tails and Knuckles were great support characters. Knuckles especially, just the type of silliness I really appreciated. He sort of had several lines that cracked me up. Dr. Eggman, I thought was really spot on. I think Jim Carrey does a great job with him. Has always done. Again, I didn't see the second movie, but in the first movie did a really good job with him. The look that he's developed as Eggman has really, really gotten good. I think that Grandpa Eggman was pretty solid. I thought he was a little bland. I thought maybe you could have gotten a little bit more spice from him, but I did think that, specifically with the flashbacks and his grand overall evil scheme was pretty good. And again, his betrayal of Dr. Eggman towards the end of the movie was pretty... again, in terms of this being a kid's movie without a ton of depth, without a ton of subtlety, I did think it was pretty strong. I thought it was relatively powerful and definitely... again, it's not going to make me start breaking down into tears, but it hit me to an extent. So I think that the Eggman pairing, Grandpa Eggman, was decent. Dr. Eggman, though, was definitely the star in terms of the baddies. And I will say, I think the best decision they made with this movie was keeping the couple, I don't even remember their names, but like the human couple that I think it was like a police officer that initially found Sonic in the first movie, and then his wife. Keeping them on the sidelines was the best call they made in this movie. They are a decent part of the middle of the story, but for the most part they are pretty ancillary to the story and not particularly involved, which I thought was an excellent decision because they are pretty annoying and don't bring a lot of value. So the plot itself, I don't think was anything special, but I still think it was an enjoyable path to follow. Again, I don't think it was particularly innovative, but I thought it was worth following along and decently paced. I didn't feel like there were too many moments that really bogged down. I think this movie was a good length and they filled it with enough action to make it worthwhile. The twist of Dr. Eggman betraying the crew was actually not something I really expected. In the trailers, you knew that this was a team-up between Eggman and Sonic and the gang. So I just figured that was what this story was. It was their teaming up against Sonic. And then eventually you find out there's this sort of person that's controlling Shadow. Sorry, team up against Shadow, not against Sonic. But I did figure that was just going to be the straightforward classic. Well, the bad guy and the good guy have to work together to defeat the real evil. So having him kind of, again, and that does change towards the end of the movie, but having that be a bit of a twist was what I honestly didn't see coming, and I thought was pretty good. And everything in this plot, again, I think that the thing that's strong about it is everything ties back to that relationship with Maria, right? Uh, with Grandpa Eggman and with Shadow. I think that that was a pretty good decision. It definitely rooted the movie in something that was emotional and gave the characters real rationale for doing what they were doing. Again, they weren't just being evil for the sake of being evil. They were being evil because they had a reason to justify their sense of evil. They thought that they were doing something to get revenge, to get payback, to even the score. I think one of the scenes that definitely sticks with me, I really appreciated when she actually was killed in the movie, which you knew was going to happen. But when they actually played that scene, when Grandpa Eggman was trying to escape with Maria and with Shadow, I did really appreciate that the lead soldier sort of stepped in and said, "Don't shoot! Are you crazy? There are children here," and it was more of a not a mutiny, but more almost a mistake, right? It was a series of bad decisions that led to the worst decision and ended up killing the child, right? It sort of was. I appreciated that in this story there was nobody that was just evil for the sake of being evil, right? All of these things sort of just spiral. It was more of things spiraling out of control, which is much more relatable, much easier to empathize with, and just, I think, a stronger way to tell a story. I don't think that in general people in life are evil for the sake of evil. I think they're evil because they think they're paying back some sins, or they've allowed something to spiral out of control. So I thought that scene was really good, just in terms of showing that evil actions don't always come from evil intentions. So overall, the plot I thought was pretty predictable. Again, there were a couple of small twists that I didn't necessarily see coming. Not the most surprising or innovative things in the world, but overall a good plot line that was, mostly um, carried by its characters and the character arcs, as opposed to the plot itself being particularly crazy good. But I did enjoy the plot overall, and again, it was jam packed with enough action, enough silly jokes, and enough sort of twists and turns for it to be worth having a couple hours of your attention. The visuals and the sound effects, I always like to have a little section for that. And again, this is a weird movie that is real, whatever. It is not animated, it's real life actors and whatnot. I can't think of what that term is for some reason. Live action, but they have these animated characters. Obviously, the first introduction we ever had to Sonic as a movie character in at least this iteration. I don't know. I think there have been past shows. I don't know if there were any movies in the past. But was that horrible, ugly design of Sonic where he looked like a demented character out of some cheesy horror video game. So I do think that the visuals in this look pretty good. I think Sonic, Knuckles, Tails, Shadow all look pretty good. I thought that the spaceship that they were in, the combat all looked pretty good. I thought when Sonic went into, or when he used the Master Emerald, that all looked pretty cool. And the final battle that Sonic and Shadow had to get to the spaceship, I thought looked pretty cool. But overall, nothing crazy, nothing that they really innovated upon. I thought, again, the scene on the moon was one that I thought was really good, when Sonic and Shadow both sort of look up at the stars. Again, that's not necessarily incredible visual effects, but I did think it was cool scene play. Good writing is more of what came in, but I thought that everything looked good, and I thought that overall, I thought it was pretty impressive that they could take cartoon characters, have them look like cartoon characters, but still have it look pretty natural around actual humans and in human landscapes. The music was solid. There were a couple of cool, reinterpretations of the game music. Personally, I could have used a little bit more of the actual, the 8-bit sort of retro music. I love that sort of video game music, but overall it was solid. Nothing super catchy or anything that made me particularly nostalgic though. But overall, again, the art and the music was solid. Nothing that's particularly memorable, but I would say it was um, more of a supporting part of, a means to show off the characters and tell the story, as opposed to anything that really was impressive on its own two legs, but didn't take away from the story by any means. So just to finish it up, I'm a big Nintendo fan. I guess, Sega was obviously a little different, but Sonic was always on Nintendo consoles, at least in my generation. Sega wasn't making consoles anymore. I was too late for the Genesis, but Sonic has been in Smash Bros. Since I was in middle school. Sonic's been around. Sonic and Mario at the Olympic Games was back in '08. I'm very familiar with Sonic, and then Knuckles, Tails. I played Sonic Adventure 2 on the GameCube. So I appreciate how iconic the franchise is, and again, I sort of know the characters. That's a franchise that, despite not having a ton of, again, the games and the movies aren't necessarily nearly as popular as something like Mario or Pokemon, of course, right? Pokemon is way bigger than the Sonic World franchise. But it's an iconic franchise, and it's one that has stuck around pretty well. Especially Sonic as a character is very iconic. I tend to like more of the children's stuff, especially as I've hit more of my mid-20s, and sometimes I just find myself really overwhelmed and cynical with some of the stuff in the world. Sometimes I just want a story that's a little bit more basic, more of the rabbit and the turtle and the rabbit and the hare, turtle and the hare. Just a good, like, parable, a story that has an obvious moral of the story. It has gives you a little bit more security and hope for the world, as opposed to things that are just super depressing. So, like, I played Mouthwashing a couple of days ago. It's a very depressing, cynical type of game, right? Cool in its own right, but sometimes I just like having stories that make me feel optimistic, I think is the best way to put it. Gives me faith in the world and faith in the people around me. I do think, especially something like this, where you have that darkness and you have that trauma to work through, again, with what happened to Maria, and having these characters make these bad, evil decisions, and eventually come to terms with it and be able to repent for those things. That, again, it's not that they're just evil for the sake of evil. They're evil or making these horrible actions because of this deep-rooted trauma. So seeing them be able to work through that, it sort of, helps you, I think. Again, this is a kid's movie. I don't want to get too deep with it, but it does, to an extent, help you sort of forgive yourself, right? Alleviate yourself of some of that shame that comes along with some of the bad decisions I've made, for selfish reasons, and to an extent from my own trauma. So I think that this type of movie is one that fits really well with where I'm at in my point of life and the type of stories that I like to see. Again, very clear moral of the story. Revenge doesn't really work. And I thought specifically the idea that you can't really just fight pain by inflicting more pain, Just because you were hurt doesn't mean that hurting others is going to fix it. At the end of the day, you have to just accept it. You have to work through it. You have to learn to live with it. Allow it to sort of sit in your body, right? The point where Sonic said to Shadow, does the pain ever go away? And he said, no, you just learn to live with it, right? That's pretty powerful, especially for something that is more for kids, right? I think if you're 12, 14 years old, that's a hard lesson to accept, but it is one that you need to sort of hear at a young age and learn to accept as you grow into an adult. I think that especially, I mentioned it earlier, but the scene with Sonic and Shadow laying under the stars on the moon, that was pretty powerful. Definitely, hit me, and that scene, that image has stuck with me a lot. Again, I think there is, it's generally pretty shallow, but the symbolism with something like that, right? The idea that Sonic was this purely good character, but had this bit of anger and darkness in him, whereas Shadow is this dark, evil character, but clearly has this underlying current of good, right? It's very much a yin and yang situation, where the best illustrations of yin and yang are when you have the light versus the dark, but the dark has a bit of light and the light has a bit of dark, right? The idea is not that there's good and evil in the world. The idea is that in every person, in every action, there is good and there is evil. I think that, again, or even I think that good versus evil is not the best way to put it, but lightness versus darkness. Darkness is not inherently evil, light is not inherently good. There is evil in darkness, but there is also light in darkness, there is good in darkness. So I think that that sort of blurring of the lines, that sort of teaching a story where you aren't an evil person for doing an evil thing, and you aren't a good person for doing a good thing. I think that's pretty difficult to remember, especially in the era of social media where you can just hear all these awful stories and you see one snapshot of a person, and it's hard not to just say this is an evil person based on this one action. But even the most evil people, and there are some people that are irredeemable, there are some people that are just scourges to society, but just trying to remember that for the most part, people are not just good or evil. They are people that have made good decisions and have made really bad decisions. So overall, I did enjoy the story. I thought the core themes of, again, that sort of revenge versus forgiveness were pretty strong. Overall, the plot was, fine, not anything particularly memorable. I thought some of the jokes were pretty good. I thought some of the CGI and some of the scenes were pretty clever. So, like in Gun's headquarters, when they had the like low versus or the light versus heavy gravity, I thought that was pretty cool. I thought most of the plot and most of the visuals too were pretty forgettable. And there was definitely some dialogue and some characters that were kind of obnoxious and annoying. And again, I appreciated a lot of the silly stuff. There's a big difference between being silly and being annoying. I tend to like some of the childlike humor. Again, Knuckles' humor was stuff I generally appreciated, but there was definitely some parts that were annoying. But for the most part, the plot wasn't necessarily dragging. I did feel like I took enough away to make this a good movie. Again, some of the characters, again, I watched this movie a few weeks ago, and the memories I've had of it, it's not one that's stirring in my head all the time, but I do have some good memories of it. There were definitely a few scenes that have stuck in my mind. And again, a couple of the key takeaways, a couple of the moral of the stories have definitely stuck with me, and I thought were impressive. So overall, this isn't one of my favorite movies, but it was a good movie that I would definitely recommend seeing, and I think is going to have appeal to most people. So I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Not the strongest score ever. Again, it's not a particularly novel plot, but there were some really strong moments. And again, I really liked Shadow as a character. That's just sort of a good way. That's a personal just favorite of mine. That sort of broody bad guy, but with a good heart. That trope is one that I really love. So 7 out of 10. A good score. It's far above average, but nothing groundbreaking. But yeah, I would recommend going to see the movie if you haven't seen it before. And I think one of the best parts is that it is good for any age, good for any sense of humor, and has a message that is positive and I think is worth seeing. So yeah, that's all from me. Thanks for tuning in.